Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Arctic. An expanse of white that isn't truly white, where the ice shifts from pale gold under a low sun to glass blue in shadow, to a bruised grey when the sky tightens with cloud. A place where the wind cuts deeper than a blade, where the air tastes of salt and old snow, and where silence can feel heavier than the loudest city. It was here, in the far northern reaches of Canada, that two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, vanished in the late 1840s, swallowed by ice and time. They were the pride of the Royal Navy, sent to conquer the last great blank on the map, the Northwest Passage. Yet all 129 souls aboard disappeared, leaving behind only scattered bones, cryptic notes and fragments of a story as frozen as the world they sailed into. Picture London, May 1845. The city is alive with the hum of an empire at its peak, the clatter of horse-drawn carts over cobblestones, the briny tang of the Thames, the clink of naval uniforms in crowded dockside taverns. Down at Woolwich Dockyard, two ships sit moored side by side. HMS Erebus, 105 feet from stem to stern, her black-painted hull reinforced with iron sheathing, a ship that had braved Antarctic ice under Sir James Clark Ross and returned crowned with glory. Beside her, HMS Terror, shorter but stockier, forged for Arctic punishment and known for surviving the savage crushing of pack ice in an earlier voyage. Both were bomb vessels by birth, designed to withstand the violent recoil of heavy mortars, and now refitted as icebreakers for the greatest polar challenge of their age. On their decks, masts stood tall and defiant, rigging singing faintly in the breeze. Below, coal bunkers had been enlarged, and steam engines installed to drive screw propellers, a revolutionary touch for the era. Their bows were clad in iron plate, capable, it was believed, of forcing a path through the thickest Arctic ice. The Admiralty had spared no expense. These were not just ships, they were instruments of imperial ambition. The crew, 129 souls in total, were a portrait of the Royal Navy's finest. Officers in gilt-trimmed coats and polished boots. Able seamen hardened by years of gales and gunsmoke. Marine sergeants drilled to precision. Young ship's boys quick on their feet, tasked with carrying messages through the maze of rigging and deck. They laughed, joked and sang as they loaded supplies, but beneath it all was the solemnity of knowing they would be gone for years. Some clasped sweethearts' hands one last time. Others kept stiff upper lips, eyes fixed on the horizon. Captain Sir John Franklin, 60 years old and carrying the weight of past Arctic trials, moved among them. His manner calm, voice measured, every inch the figurehead the men could rally behind. Commanding Terror was Captain Francis Crozier, an Irishman of quiet resolve, respected for his ice navigation and trusted implicitly by Franklin. The cargo was staggering. Provisions for 3 years, barrels of salted beef and pork, crates of ship's biscuit hard enough to crack a tooth, sacks of flour and dried peas, casks of rum and lemon juice to ward off scurvy. The holds brimmed with coal for the engines and stacks of timber for repairs. There were books, over 1,000 volumes to feed the mind in the long dark months. Scientific instruments for surveying and mapping, and fine china for the officers' table, a touch of civility in the world's most savage climate. Packed away in special cases were gifts and trinkets for trading with Inuit communities, bright beads, knives and tobacco. And there were more secret items, sealed orders from the Admiralty, to be opened only after passing Greenland, detailing Franklin's route through the uncharted channels of the Canadian Arctic. On the 19th of May, 1845, with crowds gathered along the shore, Erebus and Terror slipped their moorings. The tide carried them down the Thames, the cheers of Londoners fading as they made for the open sea. Sails bellied in the wind, the white ensign snapping high above. Franklin stood on deck, gazing north, towards the mystery and the glory that lay ahead. Few on that bright spring morning imagined that not a single man would ever return. The ships vanished into the fog of history, leaving only the haunting image of their departure, the creak of timber, the rush of the river beneath their keels, and the certainty felt by all who watched that this was a voyage destined for the pages of legend. For more than a century and a half, their fate became a legend, a riddle whispered in the halls of maritime history. Expeditions came and went, some returning with scraps of information, others never returning at all. Each year that passed layered more mystery onto the frozen tombs beneath the ice. By the early 21st century, the Franklin expedition had become one of exploration's most haunting myths. But myths have a way of drawing those who cannot rest until truth is uncovered. And in 2014, the modern age was about to pierce the Arctic silence in a way Franklin himself could never have imagined. It began in the summer months, when the Arctic ice grudgingly retreats from its winter chokehold. The Canadian Arctic's Victoria Strait opened just enough to allow the movement of research vessels and icebreakers. This was no casual venture. This was the Victoria Strait Expedition, a joint mission led by Parks Canada and backed by the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, the Canadian Coast Guard, the Canadian Hydrographic Service, and even private partners. These weren't just sailors and scientists. They were archaeologists, historians, Inuit community members, marine engineers, each carrying a piece of the puzzle in their minds. They came armed with sonar scanners, capable of sweeping the seabed with surgical precision, remotely operated vehicles that could dive into the deep, and a hunger for discovery that burned as fiercely as Franklin's original ambition. Even before they set foot, or keel, into the icy waters, there was tension. The Arctic can turn from calm to murderous in hours. Winds can rise to hurricane force, ice floes can trap a vessel overnight, and fog can close in until you can't see your own bow. And here, every delay, every misstep, meant another year lost to the long winter night. Still, there was an unshakable pull. Inuit oral histories spoke of a ship trapped in the ice, listing, its masts protruding like the bones of some frozen beast. Stories passed down over generations told of white men heading south, starving, dragging sledges loaded with strange equipment. To many in the expedition, these stories were not myth, but map, faint coordinates in the mind's eye. And so, day after day, the research team pushed forward. Icebreakers carved channels through drifting pack ice. Small survey boats fanned out, towing side-scan sonar arrays that painted ghostly images of the seabed. Hours became days, days became weeks. For most of that summer, the screens showed nothing but barren sand, scattered rocks, and the occasional whale shadow slipping under the hull. The Arctic, it seemed, was not ready to give up its dead. Then came 1 September 2014, a day that would break the stalemate. The research vessel, Martin Bergman, a modest 19-metre craft operated by the Arctic Research Foundation, was out on a planned survey near King William Island. The crew, hardened by weeks of cold work, were scanning yet another swath of seabed when the sonar operator leaned closer to the monitor. Something different. It was the shape. A long, clean line, too regular to be natural. Another pass confirmed it. Hull lines, deck structures, shadows that hinted at masts once proud above the waves. The crew exchanged looks. Careful, restrained. The Arctic has a way of tricking you with false hope. A small ROV was deployed. The tether hummed out over the side, the water swallowing the camera into an endless green gloom. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, as if a curtain had been drawn back, the image resolved into the dark, looming form of a wooden hull, its timbers preserved by the icy grip of the water. Barnacles clung like frost. Open hatches gaped like empty eyes. They had found a ship. But which ship? Erebus or Terror? The answer mattered, because finding one could lead to the other. But first came verification. The ROV danced slowly along the deck, past davit arms for lifeboats long gone, past an ornate quarter-gallery window, past the wheel still standing after more than 160 years. Every detail tightened the coil of anticipation. When the archaeologists reviewed the footage, the conclusion was inescapable. The design, the fittings, the ornamentation. This was HMS Erebus, Franklin's flagship. The find was electric. News would later sweep the world, but in that moment, out there in the cold silence of the Victoria Strait, it was almost unbearable to speak above a whisper. The modern explorers stood on deck, feeling the weight of history press in from below. And yet it was only the beginning. For if Erebus lay here, then Terror was still out there, somewhere, waiting. By late 2014, the site was secured, mapped, and the long process of underwater archaeology began. But Arctic seasons are short. Winter drives men from these waters with ruthless speed. Ice was forming again. The hunt for Terror would have to wait. 2 more years passed before fate intervened again. In September 2016, another survey team, this time aboard the research vessel R.V. Martin Bergman again, shifted their search area into the sheltered waters of Terror Bay on the south coast of King William Island. It was a calculated gamble, driven partly by Inuit oral tradition and partly by the logic that a ship seeking refuge from ice might head for such a bay. And there, as the sonar swept the seabed, another outline appeared. This one startlingly intact. The water here was clearer, calmer, almost eerily so. When the ROV descended, its lights pierced a cold green world to reveal a hull sitting upright on the bottom, windows still glazed, hatches closed as if the crew might return at any moment. The ship's wheel was there, the bell. Even the glass panes of the captain's cabin were unbroken. It was Terror, preserved in such uncanny condition that one diver later said it was like looking at a ghost that had only just died. The ROV's lights drifted over the deck planking of Terror, and the past began to stare back. At first, the archaeologists barely spoke. There was no rush of divers, no dramatic plunge into the wreck. Not yet. The Arctic demands patience, and this find demanded reverence. Every move was deliberate, as though the water itself might shatter the moment if disturbed too quickly. The camera glided past the starboard rail. The hull timbers looked almost new, the iron fittings scarcely touched by corrosion. Even the brass hinges gleamed in the artificial light. In a strange way, the ship seemed to be waiting, as if the crew had simply stepped ashore for a moment and might return at any time. Through the captain's windows there were glimpses of a world, frozen in mid-breath. Inside, drawers were still closed. Shelves still stood. A desk sat where it had been left. Papers likely turned to pulp decades ago, but the shape of life was still there, preserved in the cold, low-oxygen water. When Parks Canada's underwater archaeology team finally descended in person, the first touch of gloved hands on Terror's rail was a kind of silent handshake across centuries. The divers moved slowly, their breathing loud in their own ears, bubbles curling upward into the dim green haze above. They worked methodically, mapping every inch of the exterior before attempting any interior penetration. In polar wrecks, even the smallest disturbance can stir sediment into an impenetrable cloud, ending the day's work in seconds. Light played over the ship's bell, still mounted, still proud. A diver brushed a fingertip over the embossed lettering, feeling the raised metal of the year it was cast. The wheel stood in place at the helm, its handles worn smooth by long dead hands. At the stern, the name Terror could still be read clearly. It was not just a ship's name now. It was an echo of the last desperate months of the Franklin expedition, and the word seemed to hang in the water like a warning. What struck the archaeologists most was the completeness. Hatches were closed, doors shut. It was as though the crew had secured the vessel carefully before leaving it, not abandoned in panic, but perhaps in a final, futile hope they would return. This was a very different picture from Erebus, whose wreck lay more open, more weathered. The two ships, in their different states, hinted at different endings. Perhaps Erebus had been crushed in ice where it was found. Perhaps Terror had drifted, or been sailed under control into this bay before the final collapse of the expedition. These questions became fuel for the next phase of exploration, and with the fuel came urgency. The Arctic season was short, and every dive was measured against the coming freeze. By 2017, new dives began on Erebus as well. Her timbers, though more damaged, still held secrets. The quarterdeck revealed scattered artefacts, a mess table still bolted to the planks, porcelain plates resting on it as though a meal had been interrupted. A fork lay beside one plate, its tines blackened but intact. Below decks, divers found the officers' cabins partially collapsed, but still bearing the marks of their former life. A brass candlestick on a shelf, a leather shoe in a corner, the shattered remains of a glass decanter. Each item was photographed in place, logged, and in some cases brought carefully to the surface for conservation. Every artifact told a fragment of the story. A medicine bottle hinted at illness. A set of navigational dividers spoke of the crew's relentless effort to chart a path home. Personal items, a hairbrush, a small comb, brought the human cost into sharp focus. Yet the greatest revelations came from Inuit testimony, now woven into the archaeological process in a way it had never been before. Elders from Joa Haven visited the wreck sites, sharing place names and oral histories that matched the locations almost exactly. Their ancestors had seen one ship trapped in ice, had walked its decks, had entered the cabins, and had described in detail the men's struggle to survive. For decades, such accounts had been dismissed or undervalued by European historians. Now, standing over the very wrecks themselves, the truth of those stories was undeniable. The Inuit had been the keepers of this knowledge all along. Inside Terror, the ROV eventually ventured further. It nosed through the companionway, lights catching dust motes drifting like snow in the still water. In the officers' mess, chairs were still tucked neatly under the table. Cupboards remained closed. In the galley, the iron stove sat as it had on the day the crew left, the pipe leading up through the deck above. In one cabin, a bookshelf stood upright. The bindings of the books had rotted away, but their paper spines remained as pale, silent bricks. A pair of boots rested neatly beside the bunk, toes pointing towards the door. And there was something about that small detail, the care in their placement, that caught at the throat. In the control tent on the deck of the research vessel, the archaeologist leaned over the monitors, transfixed. The feeds from Terror were not just showing the wreck of a ship. They were showing the last sanctuary of men who had vanished into legend. Every scene posed a question. Why had they left such an intact vessel? Where had they gone? How had two ships, built for the extremes, ended their days so far apart? The answers were out there, scattered in the silt, hidden in the journals that might still be locked in drawers, waiting for the moment when gloved hands would prise them open. But the Arctic is not a patient ally. By the close of each short season, the ice began to return. Floes closing in, water temperatures plummeting. The divers would leave reluctantly, their gear hoisted back aboard as the winds turned cruel and the sky pressed down in shades of iron. And each time they left, the ships remained in their silent vigil below, untouched through the long months of darkness. The Arctic does not forget. It keeps its truths sealed in ice and silence. But when those truths surface, they are never gentle. From the moment Erebus and Terror were located, the archaeologists knew they were not simply cataloguing relics. They were walking into the last moments of 129 men. The forensic trail began far from the ships, on bleak, windswept King William Island. Here, long before the modern discoveries, searchers had found the first grim clues. Bleached human bones scattered along the shoreline, rusted tins, fragments of clothing. Some bones bore cut marks, fine, deliberate, consistent with butchery. The suggestion was almost unbearable that in the last extremity, the starving survivors had resorted to cannibalism. For more than a century, the Royal Navy bristled at such implications. Victorian pride could not stomach the thought, but modern science has a cold precision that sentiment cannot blunt. Isotopic analysis of the remains confirmed severe lead poisoning, from the solder used in the expedition's tinned food, from the ship's water systems, and malnutrition so extreme that muscle and fat had been stripped away. Faced with death, men will do anything to live a few hours longer. Even more chilling were the scraps of paper recovered in earlier searches. The Victory Point note, found in 1859, which contained two brief messages in the same margins. The first, from May 1847, spoke of all well and Franklin still in command. The second, written in April 1848, was a stark reversal. Franklin dead, 24 men gone, the survivors abandoning the ships to march south. Between those two dates lay a collapse so total it seemed almost impossible. The wrecks, now in our time, began to flesh out those missing months. In Erebus, a mess table still set for a meal hinted at an end that came during a fragile moment of normality. In Terror, the secured hatches suggested the ship was not crushed suddenly, but deliberately prepared before being left, perhaps in the hope it could serve as a refuge if the ice released it. Inuit testimony gave those images a human dimension that the artifacts alone could not. Stories told of thin, ragged men dragging heavy sledges, some collapsing where they stood. Others spoke of a ship drifting south, crewless, its masts looming over the horizon before it vanished into the ice. Generations later, these stories led modern searchers to the very places where the wrecks were found. Proof that memory can outlast even steel and oak. There is a peculiar ache in seeing these ships now. The divers' lights sweep over a captain's desk, over boots by a bunk, over a plate where the last crumbs of a meal might still cling in the sediment. Each scene forces you to imagine the man who left it there and what he endured in the hours after. You begin to hear it in your mind, the creak of timbers under pressure, the groan of ice closing in, the wind clawing at canvas as the last sails are furled, the slow, deliberate locking of a hatch, and then the sound of boots in snow, moving away from the only home left in a world of white. When Erebus and Terror were rediscovered, Canada claimed them as National Historic Sites, with a shared stewardship between Parks Canada and the Inuit Heritage Trust. It was more than legal protection. It was an acknowledgement that the Franklin story is no longer just a British tragedy, but an Arctic one, woven into the heritage of the people whose land and waters witnessed it. The work continues, each summer bringing cautious dives, careful recoveries, and new pieces of a puzzle that will never be wholly complete. Some believe that somewhere inside Terror or Erebus, a sealed journal or logbook may still survive, preserved in the cold, telling the story in the crew's own words. If found, it would be the final voice of the Franklin expedition, speaking at last after 170 years of silence. And so the ships remain, one in the open strait, one in a sheltered bay, visited each year by those who come not as conquerors, but as guests. They are no longer the cutting edge of exploration. They are memorials. Standing on the deck of a modern research vessel above those wrecks, you might feel the urge to whisper, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because here, beneath you, are two of the most perfectly preserved grave markers in history, oak, iron, and ice, holding the final chapter of one of the world's greatest maritime mysteries. In the Arctic, the wind can carry sound for miles. If you could listen closely enough, perhaps you might still hear the crack of ice against hull, the muffled voices of men at work, the sharp ring of a bell calling them to their stations, and then only silence. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.